Okay, there are a couple of things from prior lectures that I want to clean up before turning to water resources. And one relates to the lecture last Thursday on depletable resources. By the way, depletable resources are also frequently referred to as exhaustible resources. Inexhaustible in the sense that there's only a finite of the resource available, and the reason for depletable or exhaustible, somewhere along the line, well into the future, that finite resource will be completely exhausted. And there was, in the slide deck that I prepared for last Thursday's lecture, a fair amount of detail about the hoteling rule, and in particular about choke prices. You're not going to be held responsible for that. The actual modeling process is fairly complicated. However, what you will be held responsible for is the basic concepts and the principles advanced by hoteling, and I want to revisit that so that there is no misunderstanding. At least I thought I was going to revisit it. Doesn't seem to be on, Stan. Not responding. Okay, in any event, there are three critical assumptions that have to be satisfied with regard to this basic rule. And the rule... Pardon? Oh, I didn't turn it on. Oh, that's good. Okay, the basic assumptions, I want you to keep those in mind. Namely, that the resource is scarce. Secondly, that there is constant marginal cost, extraction cost, that's constant over time, and that the product is sold in a competitive market. Because if it turns out to be a monopoly market or oligopolistic market, you're going to get a far different outcome than the rule that's been advanced by hoteling. It's important that you understand the basic intuition. And the basic intuition is an application of no more than opportunity cost. If I utilize the resource today, its opportunity cost, or what sometimes is defined as its user cost, is the foregone opportunity to use it at some point in the future. And on this table, as in the lecture slides for last Thursday, you see here the trade-off that emerges between holding the resource for future use versus utilizing it today and linking that up with investing the proceeds from utilizing it today. All right? So if you look at this particular chart, this table, one option is to utilize the resource today in period one and then invest the proceeds in some bank savings account, and thus the value of what you've harvested or utilized today, if you wait one period, will be the interest that you collect on the principal. And the principal will be defined by whatever the price of that resource is in period one. Right? In contrast, you may decide instead to preserve the resource, conserve the resource, and wait and capture the value of that resource in the following period. So right away, intuitively, it should occur to you there's got to be a balance between these two alternatives, right? And the actual relationship between the two alternatives will only achieve a point of equilibrium when the values in the second period are precisely the same. Right? Okay, so this is shown in the next chart. If it turns out the price in the following period, namely conserving the resource and waiting to utilize it in the second period, if that's greater than utilizing it in the first period and putting the funds collected by utilizing it in the first period into a savings account, then you're a fool if you harvest it today, if you utilize it today. You're better off holding the resource until the second period. In contrast, if it turns out that relationship, the price in the second period for that resource, is less than what you could obtain by harvesting the first period, putting it into a savings account, then you're better off, quite obviously, to utilize the resource today. So what this all says is that in equilibrium, once you've achieved the balance between those two options, the price of the resource, exhaustible resource, in the second period must be equal to its price in the first period plus the increment that's associated with R, the interest rate that you would have obtained in a savings account. Right? If you sat down and just went through the arithmetic and asked yourself what is in your best interest, you're going to come to the conclusion that intertemporally, for any period t, the price of the resource in a future period must be equal to the price in the current period plus times 1 plus the rate of return R. Okay? And that is hoteling's rule. And it's been applied, as revealed in this graph here, it's been applied to old-growth redwoods. Now, you look at this and say, wait a minute, trees are a renewable resource, right? I mean, I can harvest trees and replant young trees and allow them to grow to be old-age redwoods. But how long does that take? Centuries. So as a result, it approximates an exhaustible resource. And if you look at the actual pricing on redwood, which is a species that's used in the manufacture and milling of lumber, you'll see that that price movement over time approximates hoteling's rule. Right? It increases at the same rate as the rule would suggest prices should increase over time, recognizing the trade-off between this period and the following period. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't a lot of environmental interests that don't want any harvesting at all of old-age redwoods. Right? It has an aesthetic value, and the commercial value with regard to harvesting and making redwood into lumber doesn't reflect the aesthetic value that exists for society as a whole. So that is the rule that I want you to be able to embrace and apply. Okay? Any questions? Yes? No, it's not inflation, because R is not the rate of inflation. R is, in fact, to do this right, if you were doing it in real terms, R would be the real rate of interest, net of inflation. Okay? Right. Now, a few additional slides that we didn't complete on Tuesday's lecture, and there's two active learning examples that we did not complete. And we want to recognize what are the implications of public policies that support food or agricultural production. These support policies, and the policies generally, ignore the environmental externalities that exist with regard to producing food. The support policies themselves serve the interest of farmers. They provide more in the way of profitability than would otherwise exist, and consequently, the actual production of agricultural products exceeds the socially efficient level. We know that straight away. If the external costs are swept under the rug and they're not taken into account, we know that the amount of production that's going to take place by firms that are in the business of maximizing profits is going to exceed the socially efficient level. And as a result, there will be some deadweight losses. And the distribution of the impact of those kind of policies, generally speaking, those policies end up with producers or farmers gaining, taxpayers losing because they have to finance and underwrite the expenditures with regard to those support policies, and consumers may or may not lose. And that depends on the form in which the support policy comes. Remember, we talked about loan rates or price supports, and in price supports and loan rates, the consumers will end up being hurt by such policies. If we've got target prices with deficiency payments, then consumers won't be hurt, but taxpayers will, because the taxpayers have the burden of making up the difference between the target price and the market price, which is defined as the deficiency payment. Okay. All right, let's look at the first active learning example. Let's make matters worse, and this actually exists in the real world. Not only are there externalities associated with such production, but in addition, the government frequently intervenes by subsidizing the inputs. In particular, if you look at water inputs, a major input in agricultural production, that water, generally speaking, is subsidized by the government. What is the deadweight losses resulting from the subsidization policy? Why don't you visit with your neighbor, sketch out a simple graph that shows us what those net weight policies are, keeping in mind that the external costs are not taken into account, number one, and number two, the subsidies move the supply curve everywhere to the right, the input subsidies. Because remember, in a supply curve, the curve itself shifts with changes in input prices. Right? Okay, go ahead and give it some thought. Okay, Gloria, can you give me the basic skeleton of the graph that you're going to construct? Just the skeleton. That's give me the full answer. Listen, just a minute. Speak up. Go ahead. You're jumping to the end point. I'm more worried about getting the graph right. You're not going to, generally speaking, you're not going to get the right answer by jumping to the conclusion, right? You got to spend some time thinking about what the key elements in your graphic analysis. And by the way, the hint is I've only given you information about the supply curve. I haven't given you any information about the demand curve. So as a result, you should hold the demand curve constant, right? Makes sense? But in terms of getting the answer, you're going to have to think about how you're going to construct the supply curve. How does the supply curve move when there's an input subsidy? And how does it move if we take into account external costs? Does that make sense? Yeah, I did say that. I could understand why you would be confused by that. We don't take it into account, but in terms of the social optimum, or the socially efficient outcome, is taken into account. But in terms of the private equilibrium, if there's no incentives or internalization of those external costs, you're going to get a solution that violates the social optimum. Right? You want to give Gloria a hand? The price shift to the right, exactly. Okay, that's the three. So fundamentally, you need three supply curves. One is a supply curve that moves from the private supply curve to the social supply curve, which takes into account your externalities, and a new private supply curve that takes into account the input subsidies. Right? Okay. So that's the basic skeleton. And here, as I indicated, the demand curve, or what we're calling marginal benefits, since we're dealing with environmental economics at this juncture. And we've got the private marginal cost, which is PMC. That is the supply curve, right? And then we recognize that the government is coming along giving input subsidies that shifts the supply curve everywhere to the right. But moreover, there are external costs that aren't taken into account, or they're not internalized. And the SMC represents the supply curve for society as a whole, recognizing those external costs. So now we've got all the elements we need to determine the deadweight loss. And all we have to do is remind ourselves that in any deadweight loss measure, there's got to be a difference between the incremental cost and the incremental benefits. And if I sum over the complete area where that holds true, that's going to be my deadweight loss. Because what we're doing is taking a scarce resource and we're utilizing it to satisfy some ultimate demand. How many went to the event on Thursday evening? The ultimate demand is determined by consumer sovereignty. And consumer sovereignty is represented by that curve MB. All right, so now we're in a position where we can first say what is the socially efficient quantity. That is the point at which the marginal benefit is equated with the social marginal cost. However, given the input subsidies, the profit maximizing quantity is going to be all the way to the right of the socially efficient quantity, which is represented by this point here on the horizontal axis. And we can proceed with our measure of the deadweight loss. And ultimately, what we're going to be doing is looking at the incremental marginal social cost that we're facing with regard to moving away from this quantity to the profit maximizing quantity, and looking at the distance between this and what the benefit is to consumers who are demanding this product. Yes, Kate?
How would, do you mind with the question for the tax I don't automatically see the social marginal need for the social marginal.
Right.
So I just would have done your regular supply demand and supply one to the right of your normal supply. Like what in the question was given away after we need to take into account the social or not to the market?
The fact that there is external cost. That's it.
Just like implicit for like
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, no, I tell you in the question if there's external costs as I come into this question. We talk about agriculture production having some external cost. Right. That's the key. Yes.
So does SMC change?
Just what? I'm sorry?
Like, does SMC, I mean, does the original SMC change? Like, does SMC
No. All SMC is attempting to take into account is the private cost plus the external cost. That's all it's taking into account. Right? Okay? Yes? Yes? What other triangle? Say what? The left triangle. Is this your left triangle here? A? Wait a minute. What are you substituting for A plus B plus C? Everything under the marginal benefit? There's no deadweight losses there. Why? What that represents is here, at this particular point here, the entire area under the marginal benefit curve is the total consumer surplus, right? Right? Remember? By the way, we're taking the same principles we developed in the first part of the course and we're applying them now to much more complicated problems. But it's the same basic concepts. All you've got to do is ferret out the facts and go back to the same principles and apply those same principles. And once again, why is this entire area the deadweight loss? Because I'm producing this quantity above the social optimum, and the total cost of society is represented by this curve, but the total benefits of society, or the incremental benefits for each additional element, is represented by the marginal benefit curve. And the difference between those two is the deadweight losses. Okay? Right. All right. Active learning 3. Let's take a different example. Suppose the government guarantees a floor price for wheat, and there's negative externalities. To anticipate Gabe's question, so I don't run into problems with regard to getting full information before you analyze this question. And by the way, Hannah, what's the difference between our discussion about loan rates and floor prices? Speak up, Hannah. I didn't ask you anything about sufficiency payment. You don't. No. Minimize your responses. Focus on the question directly. I ask you, is the floor price the same as a loan rate? Oh, yeah. Okay, now give me the intuition why. Right. You're correct. I would put it a little more simply. If it turns out that the market price is below the loan rate, what is the producer going to do? The producer is going to turn over his crop to the government. So he's going to end up with the loan rate, which is the price floor. Now, suppose in contrast that the market price is above the loan rate. He's not going to give his available supply to the government. Instead, he's going to sell it on the market, collect the proceeds, pay off the loan that he took from the government at the loan rate, and pocket the difference. Right? That's basically what you said with a little more elaboration. Okay, so let's look at the deadweight losses for the floor price or the price support or the loan rate. They're one and the same. Oh, I don't want to give you this. Oh, no, let's go ahead and do this because I've got a lot of material I've got to cover. Okay, so this is the private marginal cost here, and we've got the marginal benefits of the demand curve. But once again, I told you there's externalities. So the social marginal cost is everywhere above the private marginal cost. But the new wrinkle here, if we didn't have a price floor, we'd say, okay, what's going to happen without internalizing the externalities is that all the individual firms are going to produce at a point at which marginal benefit is equal to private marginal cost. However, if it was internalized, if those externalities were internalized, then this would be the curve representing their response to any prices that might emerge in the marketplace. And we would, as a result, have this as the decision that's being made with regard to the quantities that is being produced by each of the firms. But now we have, in addition, a price floor that is set by governmental policy, and that's represented in this graph as P subscript floor. And we see now with that price, it turns out that individual firms are not going to produce at this quantity level, but instead they now have incentives to produce all the way over here if the externalities are not internalized. Right? So when they do, this will be the profit maximizing quantity for that price floor, which is different than what a market clearing price would be. Right? And now, once again, the deadweight losses, I look at what is the social marginal cost, compare that against marginal benefits, and that distance for the entire area between the socially efficient quantity and the profit maximizing quantity gives me my deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss for this graph is A plus B plus C. Right, Gabe?
Can you mention something about market clearing price?
Yes. Market clearing price. This, if there was no pricing on the externalities, which we're presuming there isn't, then the market clearing price, in which there's no floor price, right? Yes, it would be right here, right? Yeah. Okay? All right. Now, given these kinds of distortions that exist because of U.S. policies, public policies, that have distorted the markets for agriculture and food, what attempts have been made to reform those policies? By the way, a quick aside. This is an interesting observation, which isn't in your reading or in the lecture notes. Here in the United States, when pesticides are used, excessive water is used, fertilizer, for example, when there's runoffs of nitrogen or nitrates and it finds its way into drinking water, we in the United States, in public discourse, treat that as a negative externality. If you go to Europe, they treat agricultural production not as a negative externality, but as a positive externality. Now, how in the world did they get from harm to the environment to a positive externality that society should be subsidizing? Europeans enjoy, on Sunday or weekend afternoons, driving through the countryside and seeing these little hamlets with farming operations, and they're prepared to pay for it.